Hello friends, I am Shelly Clough, and for today's video we are going to be learning some of the easiest watercolor flowers to paint. I have learned from the different classes that I've taught in person that beginners succeed with these types of flowers. I have seen it happen and hopefully it will happen for you today. So let's dive in and try some watercolor flowers. For paper today, I am just using Canson XL watercolor paper. You can find a link for this down below if you need some. I'm going to be using the size 6 Aqua Elite brush by Princeton. And then I have my starter palette of colors here. I have a swatch card of this linked in the description box below. I also sell these palettes that I've put together myself. If you want exactly what I'm using here, you can find that link below as well. I'm going to go ahead and mist my palette with some water before I get started, just to kind of wake up all of my paints. And we are going to dive into some flowers. So to wake up my brush, I like to just give it a little swish in my water jar and kind of scrape it off. And the first flower that we're going to start with today is what I call my 5-petaled flower. This is one you've probably seen before. I feel like it's a popular one in watercolor, but we will walk you through it today. I'm going to do this one in blue because I think that's a fun color for it. This is indigo that I am diving into. Just rubbing my brush in the palette and then starting a little puddle, adding some water to it here and there. And then once I've got a good concentration of that, I am going to come onto my paper and I'm going to start with 5 little marks. And I feel like the most difficult part of this flower is just spacing it appropriately. So I like to picture a person. I've got a head, 2 little arms, and 2 little legs. It's like a person doing little jumping jacks. I'm going to take those initial marks, I'm going to add a little water to my brush and then pull that color out, making kind of a rounded triangle shape. And I like to leave little tidbits of white out. It's not necessary, but you can. And then I'm just going to do that for each of those petal markers there. I'm just going to pull them out, kind of make these rounded triangles with a little bit of kind of a wave on the edge here. And I like to make them all, they don't all have to be exactly the same. It helps give a little bit of character to the flower when they have some variety to them. So here's my basic shape, and you'll notice what I'm trying to do is a couple of things. I'm leaving a little white center here. It's like the belly of my little person. I'm leaving that empty to help break up so it's not just a blob in the middle here. I am also trying to keep a little bit of white space between most of the petals, but not being afraid for those petals to touch here and there. Otherwise it looks a little too separated. So we want it a little bit tight, but not too spaced out. And then once I have that first layer of color, this is, because I'm talking while I'm doing this, this is all dry, but if you drop a little color in here while it's still wet, it creates a nice little gradient. So I'll show you really quick here. I'm just going to re-wet one of these petals. So I'm just running water over one of the petals, taking a little extra pigment on my brush, kind of tapping that in the middle. And you see how you get that pretty gradient coming out from the center there? Just helps create some dimension on your flower. So I'm just going to re-wet those petals and get that gradient kind of flowing outward. And then on this one, because I went over the whole thing, I just took a clean damp brush and I'm using that to lift a little bit of color off just so it matches the other petals and the gradient I did on those. And then once this is all dry, we will come through and add a second layer to this and create some more dimension. So we're just going to set that aside for a minute and move on to another flower. So the next flower that I want to show you is what I call a zigzag flower, and it's going to look a little bit like this one right here. And so this just sort of gives the impression of a flower. Maybe it's a chrysanthemum, maybe it's a dahlia, anything that has a little bit of kind of that fluffy, more pointy texture. And it's just sort of a fun, loose, expressive floral shape to create. So I'm going to go in with quinacridone magenta. This is one of my all-time favorite pinks. And then I am going to just mellow that out with a little bit of burnt sienna. Brown is a really great shortcut for mellowing out a color. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of lemon yellow. And it creates kind of a peachy tone here. It's just a fun color that I love. And so I'm really swirling my brush in here because I want my bristles to be totally loaded with paint. Okay, so once my bristles are all loaded up, what I'm going to do, you don't have to do this once you have the hang of painting this flower. But to help guide you, I like to start with a little super light circle. Now this circle is maybe 1/4 of an inch. And what this is the center of your flower. It's just going to help anchor your petals and help you keep that middle part open, which creates some of the shape of your flower. And then for our zigzags, we're going to take our brush and zigzag it back and forth, trying to create almost a little fan shape. And we're going to do about 3 chunks like this. So we want them to be sort of a whole chunk of zigzags. And we're going to do another one. So kind of zigzag it. And I'm varying the length of my zigzags. And then I'm going to do one more. And here, there is my flower there. And now to kind of hide that circle on the inside, I'm going to tap a little extra pigment right in the middle there. Get a little shape coming out, but there is my zigzag flower. And again, we can add a little more dimension to that in a minute, but this one is a nice one because it's really fun and playful. It's a great one to practice with, to kind of make little pattern sheets with, and you can make it really large or really small. So I love to use it for kind of tiny little flowers. So if you're doing a big bouquet and you want some little filler flowers, you can do this sort of zigzag shape for little flowers. You can also make it a lot bigger if you want to do you're trying to fill up your page and you want sort of a fun flower to add some texture and movement to your painting. You can do a zigzag like that. And then again, I'm just going to grab a little extra pigment, tap that in the middle. Kind of tap some here. And then you get that nice kind of natural gradient that happens with watercolor. Okay, so there's my zigzag flower. Now we are going to move on to our next one, which I call the donut flower. Again, this is one that is sort of giving the impression of a variety of different flowers, but I call it the donut because that's essentially the shape that it is. So let's go ahead, let's do this one in purple. So I'm going to go into this color called Purple Lake and get a nice little puddle of that going. And I like to add just a little bit of extra pigment. I'm going to go in with some ultramarine blue to deepen that purple a little bit, go a little bit more of kind of the royal purple vibe. Okay, so now that I have that, so now for the donut flower, I call it a donut because we're kind of making a circle shape, but we're making a donut that maybe a beginner made. It's going to be lopsided. We don't want it to be a perfect circle, and we want the center of our donut to be a little offset. So if I come right here, I'm going to press my brush down to get a really nice wide stroke, and I'm going to come up and sort of narrow off one side. And then I'm actually going to make the bottom a little bit wider, and then tap a little bit of pigment right in that center area. And I feel like these flowers look best in little groupings. So I'm going to do a couple more. So I'm just going to come here, and this one I'm doing a little wiggle on and doing kind of a thinner part on top. I don't want that center to be too big, but you see how it's sort of offset. I've got this side is a little wider than the top part. Just going to tap in a little extra pigment there in the middle, and then a little bit down here at the bottom. This is like my shadow area. And we'll go ahead and do one more. Again, press my brush down, kind of curve it up around so that one side is wider than the other, and sort of scoop out that bottom, and then tap a little extra color on those. And these really come to life when we add a little bit of detail in the center, and we're going to do that after they dry. So we'll show you how to do that in a minute. But those are the donut flower. Okay, next we are going to learn how to make this daisy. And this one probably looks the most advanced of any on the page, but I think there's something about the precision of the pieces of it, but my students really have a lot of success with flowers like this. So I'm going to walk you through how to create sort of a daisy-like flower. First thing we're going to do is the center. And to do the center, we are going to scumble. So I'm going to take my brush into this cadmium yellow. I want it to be pretty pigmented. And I am going to it's like a tapping, kind of scratching motion about the size of a dime. And I'm just going to fill that in so I have little flecks of white space still out, and the outer perimeter of it looks sort of scratchy and textured. Captures that center part of a flower. And then for my petals, I'm going to go in with a pink color again. So I'm just going to come back here to this quinacridone magenta. We're going to add a little bit of burnt sienna. And I think I'm just going to stick with this brighter color of pink. Maybe even add a little bit of burnt umber, which is like a cooler brown, to give us more kind of a rustic pink color. Okay, so now that I've got that, so when it comes to like the amount of paint on my brush, when I did the donut flower, I want my bristles to be really loaded because I'm going to swipe my brush over a larger area. For this, each of my petals is smaller, and so I don't need to super swirl my brush. I just want to kind of half swirl it and then tap it off a couple times so it's not super loaded with water. And then I am going to create kind of a long petal shape here. I'm just going to make an outline. So it's kind of like a rounded triangle, but longer and thinner than our 5-petaled flower. And I'm just going to fill that in, leaving a little sliver of white here and there to help that look a little dimensional. And now when I'm filling out petals like this, I don't want to go in a perfectly clockwise order, because then I end up with sometimes your flower won't be as balanced if you do it that way. So I like to sort of jump around the flower and create some of these petals. So it helps mimic that kind of randomness that exists in nature. And then as I fill in the last couple petals, it will, I can sort of balance it out at the very end. So I'm just going to come and sort of get these petals coming out. And when I do the edge of them, this edge here is a little bit squared off. So if you notice, I come out, I do kind of even a little wave in that edge, and then they taper a little bit as you come towards the center. So you do want to make sure they get more narrow as they come to the center. And I'm just going to keep going and try to fill this flower up. Now as I'm getting to the point where I have smaller gaps, I'm just going to sort of squeeze portions of petals in those little gaps. So I'm going to do my little top curve here and then just sort of paint in between. So it almost looks like it's behind these petals, and I'm just going to do a couple of those in my bigger gaps here. And this is where you can see, where is my flower look balanced? Do I need to make my petals longer or shorter in any given place to help it look more balanced? And then I'm going to do one more petal right here. And I think I feel pretty good about that. So I'm just going to add a little bit in the center here, kind of connecting those petals, making sure they're touching to that yellow part. You do have to be careful of the yellow when you are first laying these petals down. If it's still wet, you might get too much. If these colors are too different, like a dark pink could bleed into the yellow. It's nice if you get a little bit of bleeding, but if you get a lot, it will sort of overwhelm the yellow. But now that it's pretty dry in the middle, I'm going to add a little bit of orange. So I'm just going to take some cadmium red and add that to the yellow I used earlier. And just really scraping off my brush, even dabbing it on my paper towel. I want just a tiny bit on the tip of my brush. And I'm going to scumble again, just this bottom, it's like the bottom third curve of the center. And this is just adding a little bit of dimension, actually probably about half. And then I'm going to give my brush a rinse and a dab and just sort of soften some of that orange so it's not too overwhelming. And then once that dries, I'm going to add one more layer to give some more dimension there. Okay, I hope you're having fun. We're cruising through our flowers here. The next flower I'm going to do is this sort of poppy style flower. So we're going to do kind of this poppy look. It's a lot like the zigzag, but we're just creating a different perspective here. So I'm going to do that in red because it's a poppy, and why not? So I'm just doing a mix of cadmium red with a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I'm just going to come right here, and I kind of want, like, this is my anchor point. I'm going to make a V shape coming to that, kind of a curved V. So I'm going to come over here, curve in, and I just want to swish my brush back and forth, kind of letting some little points show. I want some portions to be wider than the others and some to be a little smaller. And then I like to have just a couple thin little flicks on the side there. Kind of get those little points coming in the middle. And then I'm going to add a stem to that. So I'm just going to come into sap green here. Add a little bit of indigo to my sap green because I like my greens a little darker. And then if you tap right there at the base, you'll get a nice little color bleed happening. And then I'm just going to pull down with a nice thin stem. And there is my little poppy flower. If you want, you can add kind of a little leaf shape on there. Do another little one over here. Okay. Now for our last flower. So for our last flower, we are going to do this style of flower right here. I've done it in a couple of other videos. If you've seen my other videos, it's kind of, I call it the M flower. It's just a fun, loose flower, and you'll see why I call it the M flower in just a second here. So for the beginning of that, we are again going to scumble the center of our flower. So I'm going to grab some of that cadmium yellow and make a nice little center there. I'm just going to come to this bottom corner. Again, maybe a little smaller than a dime. Just sort of tapping, dancing my brush around to create that textured middle. And then let's do kind of an orange color. I feel like that would be fun for this one. So I'm going to do some cadmium red and then add a little cadmium yellow to that. Okay, so I've got this bright, vibrant orange, and for this one, I'm going to make kind of an M shape as I create this flower. So I'm going to do 3 of them. So I'm going to start with kind of a big scoop and then a couple littler ones. So it's almost like 3 shapes that get progressively smaller. And I'm just going to rotate my paper and do it again. So I've got a big one, medium one, and a little one, and they're all just sort of connecting to that center. And then I'm going to do that one more time on this side, big one, and then I just have room for a little one there. And then because this looks a little off, I'm just going to make this one a little bigger. And you can kind of tinker with those shapes if you want, change them up a bit. And this one, again, will add a little more dimension through. That's what we're going to do now is we're going to take the first layer that we painted of our flowers and we're going to go through and add a second layer so that we get a little more dimension out of our paintings. So let's come back here to our 5-petaled flower. I have my blue color here, and what I want is to get a little bit darker of a blue than I used the first time. So I'm just using indigo here and not adding too much water. And I'm basically going to make kind of this zigzag shape, but in the center of this flower here. So I'm going to just zigzag my brush back and forth, kind of creating a little bit of shape there. Another option with this flower, if you'd like, is to take a really light wash of your darker color. So here you can see I'm just adding a bunch of water to kind of the side of my petal. And I'm going to use that color to do an outline around some of these petals. So just a really light kind of tracing with a line through the middle. Just kind of helps, if you have a significant gradient, it sort of helps pull those shapes out a little bit. And you want it to be pretty subtle. So I'm just using really light pressure on my brush. Okay, so there's our 5-petaled flower. Now we're going to come here to our zigzag flowers. And on this one for the center, I'm going to add some alizarin crimson to this quinacridone magenta. and then add a little bit of burnt sienna to that. So it's kind of a more pigmented. And again, I'm just going to mimic that zigzag shape in the center of this flower. So I'm going to do those little zigzag motions. And again, right here. And then on my big one, I'm just going to get a little more water on my brush. And there is our center of that flower. If you want, you can also do, like if it's larger and you need a little more happening, I just took a pretty light wash of that same color, and I'm just going to do a portion of the zigzags that I did before. It's probably better to do this before you do the center, but that just adds a little bit more shape to your flower. Okay, so now my donut flowers, I'm just going to keep mimicking the initial shapes that I created, making a little bit darker of a layer. So I'm taking this purple lake color. This time I'm going to add a little bit of indigo, so it's darker than the ultramarine blue that I added the first time. And I'm going to add shadow kind of in the same places I put it before. So I'm going to do kind of a swoop on the bottom here. And then I'm going to do a little bit in the middle, just kind of on a portion of the curve of that center. See how it makes those look a little more three-dimensional? And then if you end up with a line on that feels too harsh, take a brush, rinse it, dab it off on your paper towel, and then you just sort of run it over the edge of where it feels too harsh. See, that's called softening an edge. So I'm just going to do that, a little bit of those so it's not too stark. Okay, now on my daisy here, I am going to add a little bit more dimension to the center. And this one you want to be careful with because you don't want to overwhelm anything, but I'm going to add a little brown here by dipping just the tip of my brush in this burnt umber color and then tapping some of that brown right around the edge on the bottom there and coming up just a little bit. Just creates a little bit more shape in that center. And then on my petals as well, I'm just going to take a little bit of that same color I used before. This is just quinacridone and alizarin crimson, pretty watered down. And I'm just going to go over a portion of some of those petals. So I don't need to go over all of them. I'm just going over a few and doing maybe a third to a half, going along an edge, and then like a little line in the middle of some of them, just to help have a little more dimension there. You can also, if you want, again, sort of deepen up the center where those petals meet up with the middle, because that is where the color is really going to be concentrated because your petals are already tightly together there. Okay, and now this one, because our first layer was pretty dark, there's probably not a whole lot to add, but we can go through with just that same color we used before and maybe do a couple little swiping motions over. It won't make much of a difference because we used a pretty pigmented first layer, but if your first layer wasn't as dark, the second layer will add some shape to that for you. And then lastly, we have our M flower. And I am going to take the orange that I used before and add a little bit of alizarin crimson to it, which is kind of a little more burgundy of a color. And I'm going to mimic the shape of the initial petals, but just a little smaller. I'm going to do kind of a swoop there, and there. I'm just doing a portion of these petals, kind of following the shape, curving my brush strokes. It pulls that shape out. And then we're going to do the same thing to the center like we did on our daisy. So I'm just taking a really light amount of orange and kind of scumbling a portion of the center of that. And then I'm going to take a little bit of brown and do the same thing. And depending on how much water you use, you may need to let it dry between these layers. But I'm just taking a clean wet brush, dabbing off a little of that brown. And then sometimes I like to take a little bit of that brown, just very light on my brush, and kind of put that right at the base of some of these petals to help them feel a little more anchored to the center of my flower here. So just a little bit of brown, kind of pulling those in. Okay, so there is our second layer. Now there's a couple more details we can add onto some of these flowers. So for example, on my zigzag flowers, I'm going to add some fun little dots to the center to give them some character. So I'm going to go into Payne's Gray, and I want it to be pretty concentrated. I'm going to add a little bit of indigo, so it's a very bluish gray. And then with just the very tip of my brush, I'm going to add a few little dots to the centers of these flowers. You can see just those little speckles kind of give it some personality. And then on my donut flowers here, I'm going to take that same really dark bluish black color, and in that center I'm going to make these little flicks. So it almost makes them look like a poppy, and we're going to do little dots at the edges of those little flicks. Isn't that cute? So we just do our little flicks here and little dots. And then again over here. Okay. And then if you want to, you can do something similar on your 5-petaled flower. You can kind of do some little dots coming off around here. And then I feel like these flowers are pretty good. Now, one last thing, if you feel like your flowers still don't look quite like flowers, one thing that always helps is adding greenery. Something about the colors next to the green really helps our brains understand that these are flowers that we're looking at. So I am going to take some Viridian green, and I'm going to add a bunch of burnt umber to it. This is one of my favorite green colors to use. And then I'm even going to add a little bit of sap green to that. And we're going to add some leaves to our flowers. So on this flower up here, I'm just going to make a stem. So I'm going to sort of do a long, thin line. And then for my leaves, I am going to make kind of a football shape. So we're going to come here and here. I like to have a nice point on my leaf and then fill it in, leaving little flecks of white. At the base of my leaf, I like to add a little extra pigment. And then same thing over here. We're going to do kind of that football shape. Oh no, I put my hand in that one. Okay, and so you see how now that already it just looks more like a flower because we've added some leaves. And I'm going to do that with all of these flowers. We're going to add some leaves to them, help them feel a little bit more botanical. I like to do a couple little flicks of leaves off of each flower. And these, you can see, I'm just kind of pressing my brush down and making some flick motion. So they're not perfect football shapes. Like if you compare the shape of these leaves to this one, this is quite looser and not nearly as precise, but they both give the impression of greenery. So don't get too wrapped up about perfect shapes for your leaves. As long as you do little bits of greenery, your brain will kind of do the rest. So I'm going to come over here, do some kind of big leaves here, and you'll see that when I do these really quickly, I'm using a brush stroke to create that shape. I'll do a little flick, and then with my brush, I am pressing and lifting while dragging, so it creates that shape. And then I'll do it again, press and lift, and I can kind of get some fun shapes happening there by using my brush stroke. And that, you might need to play with it quite a bit, but it's such a fun technique to learn for flowers and leaves. So again, kind of press and lift. A little leaf over here. And let's do some kind of big leaves coming off of our donut flowers. I'm going to do like a big couple of just kind of blobs coming off here. And there we go. There are our easiest watercolor flowers to paint. I would love to see how yours turn out. You can tag me on Instagram, or you can find my Facebook community as well. I have that listed on the page of my channel. You can find a post about it there where you can share what you've painted and connect with other watercolorists. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you all in the next video.